Hello everyone and welcome back to The Little Quilter. Today we're going to be taking a change of pace because I know I've been working on the sparrow quilt, quilting on the kite and the square quilt, which was giving a bit of a headache if you've seen the last couple of videos. And I thought let's just take a moment and review a couple of the quilts that I finished. And I actually just finished doing the binding on this Minnie Mouse quilt. I had sewn everything together and I actually ended up sewing it basically the binding backwards so that I needed to go back through and unpick it. And once I did that, it came together really, really quickly because, again, this is a really small quilt. It's probably about a crib size quilt. And so I just wanted to go through them. The other quilt I've got behind me here is the Bluey quilt, which my daughter picked out the fabric as well as the background fabric of Mickey here. And so I just wanted to talk to you guys about what I learned from these two quilts and things that I would consider doing again or not doing at all. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, so I thought we might start off with actually the more disappointing of the quilts, which is actually the Bluey quilt. And I don't think it's overall that bad of a quilt, and certainly my daughter likes it. She just really wanted a quilt with Bluey on it, and she likes Mickey on it. I did embroider her name on the back of it, so I feel like she definitely enjoys seeing her name on there. If you haven't done that for a kid, that is something that I would consider doing again. And in fact, on the sparrow quilt, I do have plans of embroidering her name onto the back of the quilt so that she has that personalization to the quilt. So the other thing I did with that embroidery is I just embroidered it on there, and then I did not worry about the quilting going over that embroidery or around it or any of those things. And I think that that looked totally fine. So don't be discouraged by putting that embroidery on and then going, oh, but I'm going to quilt over the top of it, or oh, I need to note it. I think it looks fine. It's just something that's there to sort of to be fun and interesting, not necessarily a focal piece for the quilt. So again, always stay true to that thought of one side is the most important side. And so for me, the quilt top is generally the most important side. And so putting that embroidery on the back, not a big deal. Just go ahead and do the rest of your quilting like you normally would. Okay, so let's jump into why this is probably the more disappointing of the quilts in how it turned out. Size-wise, it is a bit weird, and I'll put it out, show you guys, because it's basically just 2 feet of fabric by width of fabric, and it's a little bit shorter, obviously, because of, you know, just binding and edging and all of that. So it's a funny size, but I did want it to be long so that it would cover her feet as she gets bigger, but still have that like small baby blanket size. And that's something that she has been complaining about as well, is wanting something that's longer to cover her feet. Now, why is this quilt a bit disappointing? And I think that that has to come down to I did this with a pantograph. And not to say that pantographs are bad, but as a beginner pantograph and somebody who is hand guiding the pantograph, right? If you're doing this with a machine and it's just going through and stitching, I don't think you're going to have too many issues with that. If you're doing it by hand, this type of design is probably not the best design for you. So, and I will tell you why. This is a design by Urban Elements. It's called Heart Clams, and it's a 7-inch wide pattern, and it's a double row pattern. So, to show you kind of the up close, this is generally what we're working with here on this. And the problem with this design is the concentric circles. The spacing of it is really, really difficult for me, at least, to do on this. And I've done 2 other pantographs. So the Harry Potter quilt I did a pantograph on, and I did the what was the other one? Oh, and I did the Christmas quilt, the reindeer crossing quilt, with a pantograph on it. Both of those had more flowing designs to them. They were repeating designs, and all pantographs are repeating designs, but it was a lot more flowing than this one. And so the issue is these right here. So all of these circles that go back on each other, it's just really hard to keep that consistent. And if you've listened to any other of the long arm quilters or free motion quilters, consistency is key. And so it's very noticeable on the quilt where I've messed up, because it would be like drawing a rainbow and then having a squiggle line rainbow over the top of it. You're gonna notice that rather than those beautiful, perfect lines, right? Now, again, does my daughter care? No. Is she evaluating my quilting? No. And so it was a great learning point, and I'm glad I did it on her quilt. So whenever I look at pantographs in the future and purchasing them, I'm definitely going to be looking at, is the design more flowing, or is the design something very concentric or something that has very specific spacing? Because I feel like in this quilt, that specific spacing really let me down. And even having that knowledge of, I'm not going to stay right on point, there's going to be a little bit of differences, it was just too much for me. And for some people, it probably wouldn't matter and they would have loved the design and been quite happy with it. But for me, it was a little bit much. The other thing of note is, in this design, you can see you do this heart pattern here, and then you come back down. So you actually have to double stitch that. So you come up, do your heart, and then you come back down to continue the pattern. Again, that could be a point of contention, and that if you are not right on point every single time, some of your stitchings for that heart may be right on, some may be a little bit off, depending on where you're at with that line. So again, another thing to just consider whenever you're picking out your pantograph that you want to use. I'm totally all for pantographs. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy doing them. Doing a pantograph on a quilt is just very freeing because you're just following a line. There's no thinking of what design am I going to do next? Am I following? Am I doing the right thing? Oh, was I supposed to change? It's just very freeing to just sit there and quilt and not have to worry about anything of being on the line or not. In this instance, it was a little bit more stressful. So just take note of that. The last thing that I want to note is just the fabric itself. So it's this bluey fabric here. And then on the back, we have the Mickey Mouse fabric. I don't think that the stitching on the back of this is as noticeable. It's just a lighter fabric. I did do a light pink thread over all of this. It's a little bit more noticeable on the blue fabric, but I was okay with that. Bluey is a girl, Bingo is a girl. My little girl is a girl, so having pink on there is not worrisome to me. And then I decided to go around the border here with just some scrap fabric that I had that was stars. I went with something that had a blue to it. It was just the one that seemed to fit the most with this quilt. All right, let's move on to the fun quilt. And I say the fun quilt, this quilt was pieced by my mother, and she just didn't want to hand stitch it or to do it on her sit-down machine. And so she gave it to me knowing that I had a long arm machine and I could just get it done. And it turned out to be a lot of fun. So what I decided, because there was no real pattern, there was no real sort of setup to this, I think my mom just literally took scraps of fabric and sewed them together in whatever design she felt necessary. She even threw in a lot of fun ribbon, which I know my daughter's gonna love. She actually hasn't seen this quilt really in completion because I literally just put the binding on it. Now, what do I love about this quilt? I love all of the differences. So I just decided, because there was no pattern with this. My choice was to just do a whole bunch of different styles, patterns with no rules, no regulations. Just choose a design and let's put it on that square. A couple of reasons or a couple of ways that I decided to do this. I looked at Pinterest to get some ideas. I looked at YouTube videos to get some ideas, and some I just kind of doodled on there and decided, yeah, let's do this. One of my favorites is this, and it's such a simple design. It is really a simple design, but I love this on this white fabric on point. And I did this and I thought I need to do this design way more often because it's so fun and it gives such a great texture as well. So especially for a kid's quilt, having that texture there, something for them to rub, having that difference, it's really nice. And then from there, I did some of them are real crazy. This design is kind of wild. Some of them are a little bit more ones that I've done before. But it was a lot of fun, and it's a great idea for a practice quilt if you're wanting to practice different designs and see how you feel they work for either the fabric, because the other thing that's nice is there's a mixture of just solid tones in here combined with some different patterns on here, and that helps you to see those designs and go, okay, what's really gonna pop and what's just being lost in the fray where you just don't see it because of the fabric design. And I think that's really important as long arm quilters and as free motion quilters. If you're designing a quilt and you end up putting it on a quilt that has a really busy fabric and it's just totally lost, there's a point of, why did I choose that design if it was really intricate? So I think that's something that's really important to note, and this is a way to sort of figure that out on your own. How are these things going to come through, right? I decided again to use some scrap fabric for the binding, so it just had it's like a cream tone with these little black dots. I thought it looked really cute against this, and since again there's no pattern, I wasn't too worried that there's a lot of white and there's really not a lot of cream on here. I think it's fine, and all of the polka dots along here really match with the polka dots on the actual quilt itself. For the back of the fabric, I decided to use a minky. Again, I do like to use a minky fabric whenever I'm quilting on a kid's quilt. I think it could be great for an adult's quilt as well, especially if you're going for something with a lot of weight to it, but especially for a little kid's quilt. I wasn't as worried about the compact design on this because this quilt is so small. I have mentioned a couple of times about having a really open design if it was going to a little kid, because it's easier for them to move around because all of that dense quilting will make it heavier. In this instance, I wasn't that worried. Like I said, it's such a small quilt. It really doesn't matter, it's so small. So that's another thing that you might take into consideration when you're designing a quilt. How big is the quilt going to be, and does that change how densely I want to quilt it? If it's a bed quilt and you want to quilt it to death, go for it. It's just sitting on a bed. If it's a quilt you're carrying around and it's a large quilt, which doesn't always go hand in hand, let's be honest. Most of the time we're carrying around smaller quilts, but especially a baby quilt. If you want to densely quilt that sucker, I say go for it. So I flipped the quilt around because I just wanted to share a couple of other things about the quilting designs that I did in this and something fun. So I know a lot of times we get really focused on a design, right? So we get focused on, leaf patterns or the circles, or doing almost like a checkerboard pattern. And one of the things that I decided to do in a couple of these blocks, because they were just really weird shaped blocks, so I had this square kind of in the middle of nowhere, and then I had this other really small like rectangle over here. And what I ended up doing was actually drawing more of a design, or quilting more of a design in there. So I have a bow here to mimic Minnie's bow, and I have a flower here to mimic just the flowers and that we have in the quilt, as well as just, I feel like Minnie's always getting flowers from Mickey's, and there's just a lot of fun with that. What I like the most about this quilting design is the background though. So I'm going to flip it over and show you guys. So I feel like this bow really pops out at you, and the flower as well really pops out. And I really like that. Whenever I flipped it over and finally saw the back of the quilt, I was so excited that they just seemed to be so vibrant to me and so much fun. Because I know on the front of the quilt, I feel like some of the stuff gets really lost, but being able to flip it over and see all of these really cool designs kind of poking out of there, I thought that was a lot of fun, especially with the minky pattern here, because in some of these more open designs like this one, you get that minky bump that happens there. But then once you get into this part of the quilt, everything's so densely quilted that you do actually start to lose that. So that would be another thing that might be helpful, depending on if you're really wanting that bump fabric there. You have to do more of that open versus something really densely packed in there. All right, everybody. Well, that is it for these quilts. I know it was a bit of a quick overview, but they're both fairly small quilts, and one was just a pantograph. So what more do I have to say to you guys? As always, I hope that you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to comment, subscribe, like, all of the YouTube things. I love hearing from you guys and having conversation about these quilts. I know it's been a moment for these, and so I'm glad to finally be able to share them with you in their completion. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.